This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Please consider taking out a subscription to the Piano Maven podcast by going to the link that I've provided in our episode description, and that will take you to my Substack page. And paid subscribers get all kinds of cool goodies, although free subscribers certainly get the podcast. I mean, anybody can get the podcast. But if you do take out a paid subscription, it will help us keep in production, which is very important. I had a request from a listener to talk about the box set that Decca brought out fairly recently of the complete recordings for Decca by the great pianist Jorge Bolet. And this was a long-awaited project, and I wrote a review of it for ClassicsToday.com, which you can access if you are an insider subscriber. But I thought that this was a release that's worth talking about and going through in detail. In many respects, Jorge Bolet, who lived from 1914 until 1990, was kind of an outlier in his era. He was a romantic pianist who basically came of age in an anti-romantic era. And unlike many of his American colleagues who modeled themselves after pianists like Arthur Schnabel and Rudolf Serkin, Bolet's role models were Rachmaninoff and Godofsky, and he had worked with Godofsky as well as Joseph Hoffman at the Curtis Institute. And maybe this contributed somewhat to his career struggles in the 1940s and 1950s. But the romantic revival of the 1960s and early 70s somehow cleared the road for Bolet's type of pianism. And by the end of the 1970s, his international reputation was pretty much in place, and it led to an association with Decca that would last until his death. Now, it has to be said, though, that Jorge Bolet's Decca legacy gives a rather skewed view of his artistry. For starters, Bolet was open in his preference for the stimulus of a live audience to playing piano under studio conditions, and he broached the microphone not so much with dread as, I think, with diffidence. And he actually welcomed bootlegging, and he encouraged his fans to tape his concerts on the sly. And the other thing is that Bolet was in his mid-60s when he signed with Decca, and by then he was more of a seasoned aristocrat than the young firebrand that he was, by evidence of some of the best recordings he made in the early 1950s, like the Chopin Four Scherzi and the Prokofiev Second Concerto. But the Decca recordings still contain many, many beautiful things, and I'm going to be talking about them. Before he signed with Decca, he made several discs for the L'Oiseau Lyre label, which was distributed by Decca. And the first one of these discs was a recital devoted to some of Leopold Godofsky's transcriptions of Chopin etudes and Chopin waltzes. And having studied some of these with Godofsky, from what I understand, I think that Bolet's really genuine affinity for this music really comes as no surprise. And I remember hearing Jorge Bolet play some of these works in public at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and his gorgeous sound just engulfed the hall. Now, there have been more scintillating live Bolet performances for certain of the Chopin-Godofsky etudes, but the performances here have a fluidity and a majesty and an eloquence that really, really comes off quite well. And then for L'Oiseau Lyre, he made a Liszt disc, and Immediately after that, he signed with Decca, and he recorded quite a lot of Liszt for Decca. Generally, I think that the Liszt legacy of Jorge Bolet for Decca really is the prize and the center of his Decca discography. Now, generally speaking, Bolet's suave phrasing and his full-bodied sonority and kind of elegant reserve that he brought to Liszt pretty much bypassed the showmanship and the panache and the elan that we associate with Liszt players who go the total opposite extreme, like Georges Chiffre or Lazar Berman. But there are so many beautiful things here. Like if you listen to the concert etude Waldesrauschen, to take one example, Bolet animates the piece not so much through speed, but through really shaping the bass lines. And he really gauges the tempo accelerations to really marvelous cumulative effect. I hope you don't mind if I quote myself. This is a review that I wrote of Decca's box set devoted to Jorge Bolet's Liszt. And I wrote that passages often treated mechanically, such as the unisons at the outset of Mephisto Waltz No. 1, or the taxing octave sequences in the B minor sonata, the so-called Dante sonata, and Orage from Année de Pèlerinage, plus the glissandos all over Totentanz truly sing under Jorge Bolet's fingers. And listen also to the Don Juan Fantasy, where Mozart's original vocal lines in the central Don Giovanni Zerlina duet patiently float under and above the elaborate filigree. So that's a pretty good quote, and I still stand by that. The Liszt Transcendental Etudes in this recording, I think, are much more subtle than scintillating, but that was also true about Bolet's earlier recordings of the Liszt Transcendentals for the Ensayo label, and also the recording he made of most of the Transcendental Etudes in the late 1950s for RCA. But I think that the Malediction and the Totentanz and the Hungarian Fantasy count among Bolet's best Decca orchestral collaborations, and these are with Ivan Fischer and the London Symphony Orchestra. He also recorded with Fischer and the LSO the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto, and I really like this recording because it's symphonically oriented, and it's not a show-offy kind of piece that just puts the piano up front. It really has the piano integrated into the orchestral fabric, and it kind of reminds me in a way of what Siqueira Costa's Rachmaninoff Third is like, or think about Van Cliburn or the Vladimir Ashkenazy Eugene Ormandy recording. And when it comes to solo Rachmaninoff, Bolet generally stresses detailed refinement over kinetic thrust, and he almost always wins me over. Except, for some reason, the G minor prelude, that famous one, Opus 23, number 5, he plays it so sluggishly. It just is completely dead in this performance. But the variation sets are really very beautiful, and the transcriptions really, really very well done. Jorge Bolet's recording of the Brahms Handel variations comes to life mainly in the final fugue, but its coupling is much, much better. It's a marvelous performance of Max Reger's Telemann variations, and I just find this piece so tedious, but Jorge Bolet's recording really was the reference recording until Marc-Andre Hamelin came along. Now we get to some of the concertos in the set. The cadenzas are probably the only things really worth talking about in the Schumann and Grieg concertos with Riccardo Chailly and the Concertgebouw Orchestra. I just find Bolet is so lifeless and dull in these performances. But they do the Franck symphonic variations much better. And In this box set, it's presented in its original CD coupling with Chailly's recording of the Franck Symphony, which is also with a Concertgebouw. This is a marvelous recording. I think the Bolet, Charles Dutoit, Montreal collaborations in the Tchaikovsky first, the Rachmaninoff second, and the two Chopin concertos never were competitive. Although maybe Bolet wakes up a little bit in the Chopin F minor concerto's rondo finale. There's an excellent Schumann fantasy here. It's a very fine performance, and it's coupled with Schumann's Carnival, which is kind of hit and miss. But there's a selection of 16 Debussy preludes, and Bolet is just dog-tired in this recording. And there are a lot of textual misreadings. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think I cited them in an earlier review once, but this is really just not Bolet at his best. And there's a Schubert disc too, where he plays the A minor sonata, Deutsch number 784. The finale is marked Allegro vivace, but Bolet's tempo is a very labored moderato. I mean, it's just boring as hell. But I kind of like the A major Deutsch number 959 sonata, especially the first movement, because there's a kind of firmness and gravitas that I think is kind of attractive. It's not very charming at all or lyrical. In a way, it kind of parallels that old Rudolf Serkin recording of this piece, which was very austere and grim. I didn't talk about Bolet's Chopin for Decca. I'm sorry, I should have talked about that before. His Chopin ballades are not the most dramatic and ardent, but they're beautifully played. He plays the barcarolle very beautifully, and also the F minor fantasy he plays very well. Now, some people think that the studio recording for Decca of the 24 Preludes Opus 28 pales next to the live Carnegie Hall recording for RCA from 1974 from his Carnegie Hall concert. That's kind of the critical consensus, but I do like the studio preludes because they are softer edged, but they are very scrupulous and poetic, and they really hold up over repeated hearing, so I'm a minority opinion here. In February 1990, Bolet made a studio recording containing some Chopin nocturnes and the Berceuse, and these were his final recording sessions, and they are released here for the first time, and his playing is just slow and enervated and with no energy at all. He's just obviously tired and not interested. Apparently, these were mastered from a cassette dub from whatever the original master tape was. I don't know whatever happened to the master tape, but they don't sound great, and the playing isn't really all that great. There's a marvelous 1988 studio disc with Franck's Prelude, Aria, and Finale, and the Prelude, Chorale, and Fugue. I think this is one of Bolet's better Decca recordings. He's really, really involved in these performances. However, there is a live recording in this set that was taken from a concert in Alabama, and it has an even better performance of the Franck Prelude, Chorale, and Fugue. It also has the Mendelssohn Prelude and Fugue in E minor, and a wonderful performance of the Liszt Fantasy on Bellini's Norma. And it just makes me wish that Decca had recorded Bolet in concert more often. I know for a fact that Decca did record Bolet at Carnegie Hall in 1980, and that tape kind of circulates in the underground. But unfortunately, we just have this one live recording. And for this reason, I would say that nobody who really cares about George Bolet should be without the Marston label's amazing 6-CD anthology of live performances, which is called George Bolet Volume 2, Ambassador from the Golden Age. And also the Audit label brought out 3 multi-disc volumes devoted to George Bolet's German radio recordings. And these all, I think, show Bolet to be much more scintillating in live performance or even live in the radio studio. But still in all, I think serious piano mavens will want to know about the Decca Complete Bolet edition. And it includes a booklet with full discographical information, and there's a very sensitive and very informative essay in the Decca box by Jonathan Summers. Now, do you want all of these recordings? Is it worth getting the box? It's hard to say. I would cherry pick if I was you, although if you do buy the box, you'll probably gravitate more toward the better recordings than the ones that I like the least. I'm sure you will. But certainly Bolet's Liszt, his Godowsky, his Franck, some of his Chopin, and of course the live Alabama concert are all definitely keepers. Oh yeah, and the Reger Telemann variations, if you can deal with such a boring, tedious piece, but, Bolet plays it as if it's the greatest music in the world. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to you and I being together for our next Piano Maven episode.